And welcome to the 2021 Minnesota Civil War Mini Symposium via Zoom. I'll be your moderator. My name is Stephen Osman, and you may recognize me from previous symposia that we've had at historic Fort Snelling. I was the one up front who introduced the speakers and tried to keep things organized with the help of a very hardworking committee that actually put the event together. This year we had a relatively smaller committee. There were 4 of us involved in putting together this mini symposium. Carol Van Ornum, who will be acting as our, I don't know if webmaster is the term, but Carol will be pulling the strings behind the scene. Steve Cook, who helped with contacting speakers and making some of the decisions, and Bailey Schluter from out at the Meeker County Historical Society, who is really the one who pushed us to do this mini symposium this year. We're planning on a full symposium in 2022, and of course we'll need people to help with planning on that. So if any of you have interest in assisting in this work, in planning a theme or finding speakers for 2022, please join us in probably September. We'll have our first meeting as we start to plan this out. And in the past, we've only actually had 1 or 2 meetings before we've been pretty sure on what we want to do, who our speakers are going to be, and so forth. And after that, we just communicate via email. So there's not a huge time commitment in assisting with the planning. Location will be an issue in 2022. As you probably know, the Fort Snelling History Center has been demolished and the former hole in the ground has been filled in. The new visitor center, which they're hoping to open in the next year or 2 in the old cavalry barracks at Fort Snelling, will probably not have adequate seating and space for us to do a symposium there. So we'll be looking for a new facility. Litchfield has interest in hosting us in 2022. And at this point, I see no reason why we couldn't simply do what we had planned last year, which was a shuttle bus out from the western part of the Twin Cities, a field trip as part of the program, and so forth. So we'll probably be in Litchfield in 2022. After that, the question is, do we want a permanent or semi-permanent place to meet, or do we want to go back to where we were 15 or 20 years ago, which is rotating among the various Minnesota roundtables, each having a chance to host one of the events. Another event coming up in 2022 is the Southern Battlefields Bus Tour. We did one about 1.5 years ago, and it's a cooperative thing. We simply find out what the costs are going to be, and everyone splits those costs for a bus tour to a number of Civil War battlefields. This next year, we're thinking of heading to Chattanooga and then proceeding from Chattanooga down to Atlanta, visit the battlefields there, swing down to Andersonville Prison, then back up to an Atlanta. There would probably be an option either to fly to Chattanooga and fly out of Atlanta, or to take a Minnesota bus all the way down and back, which would of course involve a couple of overnights in a bus, which is doable if you want to save a little bit of money, but not the most comfortable option for many of us who have been there and done that many times in the past. The program this year involves 3 speakers. Each speaker will have about a half-an-hour presentation, followed by time for questions and answers, and then followed by a short informational program. The first informational program is on the new museum planned for the Minnesota Military Historical Society. This museum will be outside of Camp Ripley, right along the main highway up to the northern recreational areas. And the second presentation then between the programs will be an introduction to the several Minnesota Civil War roundtables, of which right now there are 9. And we'll do greetings from those roundtables. If there's no representatives online, I'll simply read the information that they've provided me. We're going to try to keep on schedule in order to finish the last session no later than 4 o'clock, a little earlier, hopefully, so we can get outside and enjoy this beautiful sunshine. One other announcement, please put your screens on mute. There should be a button on the lower left of your screen. That way, if somebody comes into the room to talk to you, or the dog barks, or your phone rings, we won't all have to listen to it. When we do questions and answers a little bit later, if you have a question, you can raise your hand. I'll try to call on you and then unmute your screen to give the answer, or to give your question. And again, your mute button should be on the lower left of your screen. It's like a little microphone. Just click that, and then you'll get an X across it. It'll turn red, and that means that we're not listening to what your microphone has to say to us. And Brian, are you on board?
I am here.
Good, thank you, Brian. Then I think we are ready to begin. Our first presentation is on Minnesota's lesser known generals. And Brian Pease is the site manager for the Minnesota State Capitol Historic Site. He's worked for the MHS for 32 years now, 11 of those as a site manager. Brian oversees the Capitol's guided tours, interpretive programming, and all things historic in the Capitol, including care of the original furniture, the artwork, and the artifacts. He was the project manager for the Minnesota Battle Flag Restoration and Conservation Project from 2009 to 2012. During the recent Capitol Repair and Restoration Project, he was the main advisor on history and historic preservation of the building. He has served as president of the Meeker County Historical Society. And as a kid, the GAR Museum out there, the GAR Hall, was his history sensorium. Some of you will know what that term means. Brian was raised in Litchfield, and he now resides in Roseville, Minnesota. Brian, take over.
Thank you, Stephen. It's great to be a part of this symposium. It's fun to talk to other Civil War fanatics and aficionados. So I'm looking forward to, if we have time for any questions as well. But like Stephen said, a lot of you probably have been to the GAR Hall. So if it ends up the symposium being there next year, I recommend highly that you go there. Because I think within the state of Minnesota, you have the GAR Hall, you have the Military Museum, and that Randall's in charge of, and the state capitol are really our main Civil War places to remember those soldiers that fought in that pretty pivotal event of U.S. history. But I'm going to be talking about some of the lesser known generals from Minnesota. And let me share my document here. And it suddenly isn't here. So first technical glitch of the day, Stephen. Okay, sorry about that. So when reading and writing and talking about the Civil War, it's hard not to find out about or discuss some of the most famous of those generals, officers on both sides. So on the Union side, of course, we know about Sherman and Grant and Sheridan. And on the South, you all recognize the names of Lee and Jackson and Longstreet and Pickett and Bragg and so on. These were the names you read about in the newspapers, and as news spread throughout the United States, or the states at that time, about what happened in those different battles. They're the ones who signed on the after action reports and were really some of the key factors in deciding what would happen as each of those battles progressed. And they were often the first subjects that were written about after the war concluded in 1865. Well, that is more of a bigger picture, a macro view of leadership in the Civil War. since they were involved in so many key decisions. But for every great or higher ranked general in charge of an army or a corps, there were hundreds others who were division commanders or brigade commanders that relayed commands to their regimental colonels and so on down the line to the private. Minnesota cannot claim as one of our own any of those iconic generals I had mentioned. Most of our Minnesota generals would be recognized more as brigade and division level commanders. You may be surprised that there were 21 men from the North Star State who received the honor, either outright as a general or given the honorary title of breveted general. Our highest ranked officer was Napoleon J.T. Dana, who achieved the full rank of Major General. Think a moment, how many of the 21 generals can you just name on the top of your head? Not many. Did any of you come up with the names of Horatio Van Cleef or Christopher Andrews or William Marshall? Well, they too were higher ranked officers from the state, and they're the subjects of this presentation. Each one has his own interesting history in the Civil War, but also a compelling story of post-war success in business and politics. So to begin with, let's take a look at what a general was. So in this organization chart, you can see the structure is, and this is focusing on the role of these three men. They either attained the commanding position of brigadier general or brigade commander. So they were in charge of at least 3 to 5 regiments, if not more units. And then a division commander would be in charge of 3 or 4 of those brigades. So they could have 16 to 20 different units under their command. So as you move up the ranks, you're really taking on a lot more responsibilities and leadership roles. So each of these men pretty much achieved that rank. Started out usually as a colonel, moved up to brigadier general or brigade commander, and then eventually some a major general. The one thing you have to also factor in is the word brevet. Of the 3 men featured today, they were given brevets during and after the war. So Van Cleef and Andrews were breveted major generals, and Marshall became a breveted brigadier general. And all a brevet was pretty much an honorary title given for meritorious or conspicuous duty or responsibilities during your service in the war. Didn't come with any additional command responsibilities or any financial compensation that was connected to that rank. But regardless of that, the honorary title stayed with them after the war and for the rest of their lives. Most people in the state recognized their names. If you lived in the same city, you knew who they were. Because of the brevet designation, it was not an uncommon practice to refer to or address these men, even though they might have only attained the rank of colonel, but if breveted, they would often be called general. It was a title of respect and recognition of their service, an honor bestowed only upon a few men. So let's take a look at some of these leaders. Each one started their Civil War service as part of a Minnesota infantry regiment. And I'll be talking about each as their, according to their original regimental designation. Our first subject is Horatio Van Cleef. He was from the 2nd Minnesota. As you can see in this photograph, Van Cleef has more of a bookish professor's appearance. Well, looks can be deceiving. He possessed both qualities of being a well-educated and an experienced soldier. He was born in 1809 and grew up in Princeton, New Jersey. He spent 2 years studying at Princeton before he was appointed to West Point. He graduated from that institution in 1831. As a 2nd lieutenant, Van Cleef was posted at Fort Howard and Fort Winnebago in Wisconsin and retired from the service in 1836. It was when he was at Fort Winnebago that he met his future wife, Charlotte Wisconsin Van Cleef, or Charlotte Wisconsin Clark at that time. And she is often credited as being the first child white person born in Wisconsin because her father was part of the 5th Regiment and they were making their way up the Mississippi River to build Fort Snelling. And on the trip there, she was born in Prairie du Chien at Fort Crawford. And so they were married in the 1830s. Once he was out of the military service, he was a teacher in Cincinnati, and then he moved to Michigan to be a farmer. And then he was an engineer for the state of Michigan, and then moved to Minnesota to be a U.S. public surveyor. So when the war began, he was farming in Long Prairie, Minnesota. Anyone with a West Point training or military experience was a valuable asset to lead citizen soldiers into battle. He was appointed the colonel of the 2nd Minnesota Infantry in 1861. He was 52 years old at the time, which, relatively speaking, I'm not speaking for myself because I'm in my 50s, but for a commander at that time during the Civil War, that was fairly old. You have to remember the average age of a Union general throughout the war was 44. So he was considered a relatively older man. But he oversaw the regiment's training at Fort Snelling, and in October 1862 led the unit south to Louisville, Kentucky, and then was assigned to General George Thomas's division as part of the Army of the Ohio. He and his regiment saw their first combat at the Battle of Mill Springs, sometimes called Logan's Crossroads or Fishing Creek, and that took place January 19th, 1862. And it's not in the scale of Civil War battles, not a huge battle, but it was one of the first pivotal Union victories of the Civil War for the Union Army, for the North. And so what you see here is the 2nd Minnesota highlighted, circled, and they were brought in as kind of a relief regiment to the 10th Indiana, who had first encountered the Confederate forces. They were running low of ammunition, fell back, and then the 2nd Minnesota took over their position in line. And they were behind a wooden rail fence. So if you know anything about this battle, you've heard the phrase fog of war. Well, this was the fog of battle. It was a dreary, kind of a drizzly, foggy day. So these soldiers could barely see hundreds of yards in front of them. So you combine the fog with the smoke being brought by the gunfire. It was kind of a confusing battle. It was hard to see friend from foe. So when the 2nd Minnesota got to that fence line, they could see off kind of in a break of that fog, an advancing line of Confederate troops. So they fired upon them. Well, they didn't realize that was the 2nd rank of Confederates that were moving toward that fence line. The 1st rank was right on the other side of the fence. They had been laying down. And once the 2nd Minnesota let out the first volley, those men stood up, and then you basically had a hand-to-hand fight between these two, a Tennessee regiment, these Minnesota men. They're running their gun barrels with the bayonets through the fence rails. Hundreds of men were wounded, mostly superficial, but if you read some of the reports, a lot of those men had hand injuries just because of all those knives sliding through those fences. And the 2nd Minnesota helped change the battle. They were one of the forces that was credited as helping win that victory for the Union Army that day. Because of that success, in March of 1862, Van Cleef was promoted to a brigadier general. He was assigned to the 14th Brigade of the 5th Division of the Army of the Cumberland. And by the time of Perryville, which took place in October later that year, he was in charge of division. So by the time of this battle to October, span about 8 months, he was now from being a regimental commander to a division commander. And by the time of the Battle of Stones River, which took place December 31st, 1862 through January 2nd of 1863, the Army was reorganized, and Van Cleef and his division became part of the 14th Army Corps in the Army of the Cumberland under General Rosecrans. And at that battle, Van Cleef, and this is a lot going on here, but this is showing the first day of that battle. And this Rosecrans strategy was he was going to attack the right of the Confederate forces, the right of the Confederate flank. And so he had enough faith in Van Cleef and his division to be that tip of the spear. So early that morning, he had that entire division weighed across Stones River to be leading the assault of the battle. Well, Bragg thought the same way. He was going to attack with his left flank on the Union's right flank, and that's exactly what happened. So the weight of that attack forced the Union lines back, and Van Cleef and his men were brought back across the river to bolster those lines, and they were very helpful, very successful in kind of staving off a potential defeat that day. Unfortunately for Horatio, he was wounded by a shell fragment, wounded him in the leg, and it also injured his horse Bessie. and he was taken off the battlefield in an ambulance. So he pretty much was out of commission that first day of that battle. And after a 3-month leave to heal from his wounds, he came back. And the man that his soldiers called grandpaps, see, there's that age thing again. When he returned to his division in Murfreesboro, he was greeted by them in their best dress uniforms in a passing review. And later that summer, as the Army of the Cumberland was on the move to kick out Bragg's army from Tennessee once and for all, he ended up in September with the Army of the Cumberland at Chickamauga. And his division was right in the thick of the fight both of those days. Once again, it's if you know anything about Chickamauga, the line right above, pretty much north and south, where the Van Cleef's division is marked there, is that Lafayette Road, and that was the center of where a lot of that action was taking place. Earlier in the day, Van Cleef was down at Lee and Gordon's mill, and they were brought into the fight because the Confederates were basically having a rolling assault. Wave after wave of units were kind of rolling from the north to the south, and the Union line needed to be bolstered on that, what would be the right flank. And so Van Cleef and his division were pulled into the battle. And they fought for a couple of hours, but didn't behave very well by the end of the day. A lot of the men started retreating. Van Cleef had lost control of his division. And part of that was they were being overwhelmed by Hood's forces as they were advancing into that part of the Union line. And unfortunately for Van Cleef, he lost his composure. A lot of soldiers, a lot of officers said he was crying as he was trying to gather his men together to hold that line. And they beat a hasty retreat back about a mile, as you can see here. And that's where they ended up that day. So they were, didn't hold up very well in the thick of the fight. So the second day, they were pretty much where they had left the first day in reserve. And in the morning, they were moved into, and this is one of the, if you know anything about Chickamauga, one of the pivotal parts of that battle was there was a miscommunication on disposition of Union troops. And so what was once thought a gap in the Union line, which would have been close to where Van Cleef and his men were moved into to help bolster that line, they took General Wood's division and moved him out of line to plug that gap. Well, when he got there, there was no gap. There were soldiers in that position. They were just obscured by the geography in the woods. And so what that did is it left now a gap that shouldn't have been there. A gap was there for General Hood and Longstreet's corps to march right through. And that ended up being a disaster for the Union Army that day. So Van Cleef and his division, which were pulled into the reserve role, got swept up in that retreat of the Union forces. And when I say retreat, we're not talking about orderly, we're talking about shades of Bull Run all over again. People were running to get back to Chattanooga as fast as they possibly could because the army was being destroyed. So unfortunately for Van Cleef and his division, they fled with the rest. Some of his men did. Some of his units did move north into what would be the Snodgrass Ridge, where coincidentally Van Cleef's 2nd Minnesota Regiment held their ground and became one of the heroes of that battle. So unfortunately for Horatio Van Cleef, some people really have scrutinized his actions at that battle, but his was not the only division to break that day. You have to remember the entire army had crumbled. But that did have when you're looking at him personally, it did have a serious effect. I think he really, by losing his composure, or really just took it so heavily and so heartfelt that his men couldn't perform the way they should have, that it affected his ability to really function as a leader in the future days. And regardless of what the reasons were, he still was a leader of men when it counted. His actions at Mill Springs earned him a General Star, and the stout-hearted of his men at Stones River helped save the day. So it was unfortunate for basically the placement of his men in line at Chickamauga, where the major Confederate thrust was where his men were both of those days. So at age 54, one also has to consider it if the hard campaigning, he had been ill several of the days during that march, still might have had some lingering effects from his wound a few months earlier. So I think it was hard for him to feel like he could still command. So it's not really sure. I've never found any information exactly what happened, if it was by his own choice or if he was formally ordered to not be in a field commander anymore. And he was resigned to the district of Murfreesboro to oversee the soldiers there and the forces in that whole area. And that's where he ended the war. He didn't see field command after that. So he remained there until August 1865 when he was mustered out in March of 1865. After the war, he lived in Minneapolis and served as the adjutant general for the state of Minnesota from 1866 to 1868, and then again 1876 to 1882. He died in 1891 at the age of 82. Today, few remember Horatio Van Cleef. Little do most know that the Minneapolis City Park, Van Cleef Park, located just north of Dinkytown, and the U of M campus, is named for this General Horatio Van Cleef and his wife. And it's once again just a nod to the important role he played in the Civil War. This next gentleman began his military service with the 3rd Minnesota. And this is Christopher Columbus Andrews. Andrews was born in 1829 in Hillsborough, New Hampshire, and grew up in part of a farm family. In his early years, he studied law at Cambridge, and after passing the bar exam, opened his own law practice in Massachusetts. But other ventures opened up to him, and that meant heading west. So in the early 1850s, he settled in Kansas and then became a lobbyist in U.S. At Washington, D.C. for the territory of Kansas, and lobbied the legislators in Congress at that time. And then he became a law clerk in Washington, D.C. until 1855 with the U.S. Treasury Department, and then moved to St. Cloud, where he in 1859 was elected a Minnesota state senator. In 1861, he was editor of the Minnesota Union newspaper, a position he held until October 11th, when he enlisted as a 32-year-old private in the 3rd Minnesota Infantry. Seldom did a man of his experience and education remain a private. He was appointed captain of Company I and became the leader of 100 men. So the 3rd Minnesota spent the first few months of the war in Louisville, Kentucky, and guarding railroads and different postings in the Cumberland Mountains. But in late April 1862, they were garrisoned at Murfreesboro, which was a hub of roads and a large Army supply depot there. The other units stationed there included the 9th Michigan Infantry and 2 cavalry and artillery units. And they were usually posted on different roads leading into that city. Well, on July 13th, 1862, Andrews became a key player in one of the most humiliating events for Minnesota regiments during the Civil War. Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest made a swift advance into southern Tennessee with around 1,400 cavalrymen. One of his main targets was Murfreesboro. On the morning of the 13th, he quickly captured the town, including Union General Thomas T. Crittenden, and that's not to be confused with Van Cleef's corps commander. That's Thomas L. Crittenden. There's plenty of Crittendens. If you ever read the Civil War, there's a lot of Crittendens. But with all the Union defenses forces spread out on those roads, they were easily swallowed up by Forrest and his men. And he attacked each one of them separately and forced them to surrender, including the 9th Michigan Infantry. Upon hearing the gunfire, the 3rd Minnesota moved forward into battle line and anticipating an attack, and it never came. After a stout defense and eventual capture of their regiment's camp, Forrest marched his cavalry out of range of the regiment and brought forward a white flag asking for the regiment's surrender. The 3rd's Colonel, Henry Lester, a former officer in the 1st Minnesota and highly respected by his men, gathered his regimental officers into a council to consider the proposition. He asked for a show of hands. 5 of the officers, including Andrews, voted to fight. 4 voted to surrender, including Lester. Once the vote was completed and satisfied with the results, 2 of the officers who voted to fight, left to go back to their companies. A short time later, Lester reopened and re-argued that matter and asked for a vote by ballot. Well, with the absence of the two officers, there were now more votes to surrender than to stand their ground. So at 3:30 p.m., with indignation and sorrow, the regiment color bearers handed over their state and national colors, and many of the men with tears in their eyes turned over their weapons. There wasn't many things that would be more disgraceful to a regiment than surrendering, especially when you weren't even under attack. Well, you have to remember, Colonel Lester was duped by one of the masters of deception. Forrest was astute enough to not attack the 3rd Minnesota because he knew he probably would have taken a licking with that many troops to defend that ground. And by the time he faced the 3rd Minnesota, he had the advantage anyway. Like cards in his hand, he had already captured an important supply center and several military units. The capitulation of the 3rd basically gave him a full house. After the surrender, Andrews became a prisoner of war for about 3 months in Madison, Georgia. That's about 60 miles east of Atlanta, and then paroled at Libby Prison in Virginia in exchange in November 1862. Well, with their officers in captivity, the 3rd Minnesota was moved back to Minnesota to participate in quelling the US-Dakota War, and they played a major role in the Battle of Wood Lake in September. But when the entire regiment and its officers were exchanged, the 3rd Minnesota was reorganized. Colonel Lester and the officers that voted to surrender were pretty much dismissed from military service. And to fill the vacancy of the highest ranked officers, Lieutenant Colonel Chauncey Griggs was named colonel, and Andrews was promoted lieutenant colonel in December of 1862. So being second in command, the 3rd was at Vicksburg and Jackson, Mississippi. And when Griggs retired due to ill health, Andrews was made the colonel in July 16th, 1863, just a year and 3 days after they had surrendered at Murfreesboro. And here is a photo of the 3rd Minnesota. This is a painting that you'll see at the governor's anteroom in the state capitol. This is them occupying the city of Little Rock. And that was where their next move was. They were assigned to the Army of Arkansas under the command of General Frederick Steele. And the 3rd Infantry saw a little bit of the combat outside of the city. And then when it surrendered, they were, as you see here, depicted marching into the city. And here is the artist had put C.C. Andrews on horse leading that regiment into the city. Well, when they occupied that city, Andrews was surprised when General Steele put him in command of Little Rock. He became a brigade commander overseeing the 3rd Minnesota, 3rd Illinois, and the 7th Missouri Cavalry. And these forces occupied the state's capital city from September 18th, 1863 through April 27th, 1864. And the respect shown by the colonel and the men under his command to the citizens of Little Rock contributed to developing a strong sentiment of loyalty to the Union. In early January of 1864, citizens of the state took initiative to create a new state constitution, which was highly supported by Andrews. It was the first step in that state to help promote Reconstruction after the war. Well, Andrews' star was rising and he became a brigadier general in January of 1864. So he left his cherished 3rd Minnesota Regiment back in Arkansas and then became the commander of the 2nd Division of the 13th Corps. And his men were part of the last major thrust of offenses for the Union Army in the Mobile, Alabama campaign. And he was successful in leading his men in the siege and assault of Fort Blakely. And that was the last engagement he was a part of the war. And he was brevetted a Major General in March, kind of retroactively, in March of 1865. But his success working with the people in Little Rock saw him dispatched to Houston, Texas to supervise the reconstruction efforts in that area. And it really helped to have a pretty smooth transition for the provisional government. And once that was completed, he was mustered out finally in January of 1866. Now, his exceptional leadership and diplomacy skills did not go unnoticed after the war. President Grant appointed him U.S. Minister to Sweden in 1868 to 1877. He finished his diplomatic career serving as Consul General to Brazil from 1882 to 1885 in the Chester Arthur administration. Andrews was a prolific writer during his lifetime and wrote almost 40 reports and books, mostly about his observations in his travels. When in Sweden, he spent much of his time traveling around that country. And one of the takeaways from those travels was the impression left about how Sweden's timber was managed. So they would typically, instead of clear cutting a whole area of woods, they harvested the trees in a checkerboard pattern and then replanted those areas that had just been cut. Well, that experience paved the way for Andrew's future endeavors. And that's probably what he's more well known for today, was his decades-long efforts to have the state of Minnesota find better ways to manage forest resources. Now, he lobbied for decades, and people were, not really listening to some of the warnings that he was trying to let people know that the forests were not inexhaustible. A lot of people thought there'd be 100 years of forest harvest in Minnesota after the Civil War. Well, that was wrong, and he knew it. And so a lot of times your years of lobbying fall on deaf ears, and it often takes a tragic event to really start people thinking that maybe you have something that's worth some value. And that would have been the Hinckley Fire in 1894. That was a tragic result in the loss of 400 lives. And there were other major fires early in the 20th century that people started thinking they should be better stewards. And that's where Andrews really made an impact. He became the first official chief fire warden for the state and got the timber companies and logging companies to clear out the slash, the debris that was left after the harvesting of the trees, and also began the practice of replanting to replenish that resource. So until his passing in 1922, he was the state's strongest advocate for forest conservation, and today is considered a pioneer. If you drive up to Duluth on Interstate 35 between Willow River and Moose Lake, you'll find the General C.C. Andrews State Forest. This public accessible resource is a legacy to not only a Civil War commander, but a champion in conservation. Our next person is William Marshall. He was a Missourian. He was a Southerner who moved to Minnesota. But it took a while to get here. He grew up in Illinois and then with his brother moved to Galena when he was 16 years old to work in the lead mines. It was there he learned to be a surveyor. And then he moved to Wisconsin in 1848, ran for their assembly, won the seat, but then he never got the election certificate because it was contested. The opponent said he didn't live in the district, which was true. So he couldn't serve in the legislature, but that early venture into politics bode him well the rest of his life. In 1849, he moved to St. Anthony and started a hardware store and then surveyed the town of St. Anthony. So he was the one who laid out that town. He won a seat in the first Minnesota Territorial Legislature and then moved to St. Paul and became one of the most successful hardware merchants in that city. He soon went into the banking business and also began a new venture in dairy farming and stock raising. And a lot of people consider him to be the first to bring in hybrid cattle into that brand new state of Minnesota. While he was busy carving a niche in all these multiple business ventures, he also had a significant role in creating a new anti-slavery party in the state. He was the presiding officer in the convention that established the Republican Party in Minnesota in March of 1855. By the time the war was just beginning, he ventured into the newspaper business and ran the St. Paul Press, which was a Republican Party organ, and was a fervent supporter of Ramsey, who really helped him move forward in his political career. Ramsey became a U.S. senator with the support of this paper and many others in the state. So for Marshall, it boded well to have friends in high places. When the second national call for volunteers was brought forward by Lincoln, he was commissioned by Alexander Ramsey to be the lieutenant colonel of the 7th Minnesota. And that was on August 28th, 1862. Well, the newly commissioned officer didn't have much time to acclimate and become comfortable to his new military appointment. His first duty was to lead a partially filled ranks of the 7th Minnesota Infantry up the Minnesota River Valley as part of Henry Sibley's expedition to protect the settlers and end the U.S.-Dakota War. And he was part of the relief party that relieved the beleaguered soldiers at the Battle of Birch Coulee, and then later on was a pivotal part of the Battle of Wood Lake, where his men made a charge that helped seal the deal for the the soldiers that day. And then he served on the military commission. That was the judge. He served as a judge for the military tribunal, or the trials for the Dakota combatants, in November. And as you know, a lot of you know, there were over 300 Dakota men slated for execution. Only 38 of those were hanged. Most of them received pardons, but even with the pardon, they spent some significant jail time, prison time. And then he led the remnant to the over 2,000 Dakota women, men, and children, and the elderly to Fort Snelling, where they were interred until they were moved to the reservation lands in 1863 in South Dakota. And Marshall was part of the punitive expedition in 1863. And so Stephen Miller, his commanding officer, was stationed back in the state to kind of be in charge of the military in the state of Minnesota at that time. So he took command of the regiment as part of that expedition, and they were part of the Battle of Big Mound, and that was pretty much the extent of their action there. And then eventually he and his command were transferred down to the South in October of 1863, and they had their first battle at the Battle of Tupelo in July of 1864. And even though they were protecting more of the wagons and supplies, they were engaged throughout those 3 days. And they lost 10 men and 52 wounded. And Marshall had a couple of close calls in the battle. His horse was shot and a spent ball lodged in his felt hat. In the following months, Marshall's division was chasing Sterling Price through Arkansas and Missouri, and then they were detached from the Army of the Tennessee and moved to Nashville to bolster those cities' defenses in 1864. And another painting that you'll see in the governor's reception room of the various regiments at the Battle of Nashville. So when John Bell Hood was making one last attempt to take over Nashville, the defenses around the city were bolstered, as I mentioned, by thousands of more troops. And Hood had dug in trenches around the city, and General Thomas sent 3 of his 4th Corps out to displace them, to move them out, and to destroy them was the goal. And so the 3rd Brigade, with Marshall leading the men of the 7th Minnesota, was part of the assault on that first day on redoubt number 33, and they were successful in taking that defensive position. Unfortunately, the brigade commander, Sylvester Hill, was killed by shell fragments during the assault. And Marshall then assumed command of that brigade and led it the following day into the teeth of the battle at Shies Hill. And this is a graph I put together, or a chart that shows kind of the disposition of Minnesota men. Minnesota at Nashville had 4 regiments. That's the largest concentration of soldiers from Minnesota in one battle. And they took a wall. There were over 300 casualties during that assault, those 2 days. And the 7th Minnesota, under now control or command of Marshall, is on the far left of where they encountered those Confederates on the part of Shies Hill. So as he led the assault, it was basically going 400 yards through muddy cornfields under withering rifle fire and artillery fire. And they captured those Confederate positions and also captured several artillery pieces and hundreds of prisoners. And during the assault, Marshall was one of the few officers who rode his horse, Don, in the charge, and one of the few who made it across the 400 yards without losing his mount. When he and his men reached the Confederate trenches and the enemy was in retreat, he rode forward and captured a rebel artilleryman. And as at the end of that encounter, one of his men came up to him and kind of scolded him that he shouldn't, expose himself so much. The captured Confederate officer overheard the remarks and said, "Hell, any man that's brave enough to ride a horse across that field will never be killed." So Marshall was lucky that day in battle. At least he dodged enough bullets to survive without a serious injury. Good example of that luck took place when they were waiting for the assault to begin. The colonel had doubled up his leather gauntlets and placed them in his coat, in his uniform, and the mini ball smacked into his chest, but the glove stopped the bullet and probably saved his life. Following that success at Nashville, Marshall and his brigade moved with other armies Union armies down into Alabama. We're also part of that mobile campaign in March of 1865. But eventually, luck does change, and Marshall's luck did change on that march. If you're a brigade commander, you're in the front of your brigade as you're marching down the roads or in column. And that's where he was. And his old regiment, the 7th Minnesota, was farther back in the column. And they could hear a gunfire in the front of the line or the front of the column. And as they marched to close to that location where they heard the gunfire, they could see a group of men around Colonel Marshall. William Marshall was leaning up against a tree, bleeding from his neck. And he was shot by a sharpshooter. And the bullet went into his neck and exited out near the spinal cord. So the brigade, and in particular the men from the 7th Minnesota, they knew the war was wrapping up. And so for them to have this beloved officer probably going to die just a few weeks from the end of the war was really hard for them to take. It was something that they lamented, that loss. Well, about a half hour later, as they continued that march, they could hear cheers from farther back in the column. And a moment later, here came Marshall on his horse, Don, with a bandage around his neck, and moved right back to the head of the column. So when they made camp that night, every man from the brigade walked to his tent where he was sitting on his stool and congratulated him for being alive, and no doubt to shake the hand of one of the gamest men they ever know or had ever known. So as with Christopher Andrews, the Mobile campaign was the last engagement Marshall would be a part of. He received his brevet as a brigadier general in March of 1865, mustered out at Fort Snelling in August of 1865. Well, his experience leading men served him well for the next chapter of his life. He wouldn't command several hundred men, but 400,000 people in the state of Minnesota. He became the 5th governor of our state in 1866 and served until 1870. He had 2 terms. You have to remember back then, governor's terms were only 2 years at a time. He was the second of 8 Civil War veterans to serve in that office. Stephen Miller was number 1. He had achieved some notable victories in his political career. In 1868, he was successful in persuading voters to change the state constitution to allow African Americans, and these would be African American men, the right to vote. And the economy boomed. The city or the state's population doubled. And when he left the state as the governor, he left it better than when he started. As his political career ended, he went back into business as a banker, and then eventually had some pretty big farm enterprises in Roseville, Minnesota. But in the 1890s, his health was deteriorating, and so he moved to California to hopefully regain that health. But he never did. He passed away there in 1896. Unlike the others, his legacy is more evident in the place names of the state. Marshall County and the city were named in his honor. One more interesting chapter in his life is Marshall's horse, Don. He came back with William Marshall to Minnesota and was a treasured companion. He, like other officers during the war, relied on the horse to accomplish their work. So if you want to know how important that was, you can see Don today. He's buried in Roselawn Cemetery. And that was one of the conditions when Marshall sold that farmland is Don, who had died before that purchase took place, was buried in the pasture. And Marshall said, "You cannot remove my horse." So if you want to go see Don, his war horse, go to the northwest corner of Roselawn Cemetery. And kind of incidentally too, Horatio Van Cleef brought his horse Bessie back home with him too. And she's buried in his front yard, or basically in front of a barn that they had built on the corners of 5th Street and 5th Avenue in Southeast Minneapolis. And Bessie is still there today.
And Brian, I've got to step in now because we are out of time.
Okay, I figured
But
so.
I would encourage all of you to visit the Minnesota State Capitol in the future and learn about these sorts of stories and plenty other really good Civil War stories. I know Brian, as a Civil War enthusiast, does tend to skew some of the presentations in that direction. So I would encourage you to visit the Minnesota State Capitol once it's opened up to visitation. Again, thank you, Brian.
You're welcome.
We're going to move along now to our next presentation, which is more just an announcement by Randall Dietrich, who is now in his 4th year as Executive Director of the Minnesota Military and Veterans Museum at Camp Ripley. And prior to this appointment, he worked closely with several roundtable members as part of Minnesota's task force to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. He assisted with the creation of the Minnesota in the Civil War exhibit at the History Center in St. Paul, and he produced related on-air documentaries for the Twin Cities Public Television. And I should just mention that he also is doing a monthly World War I roundtable, and you can get in touch with the museum up at Camp Ripley if you would like to be part of the audience of that great Zoom program that happens once a month. Randall, it's all yours.
Thank you, Stephen. I appreciate that, and nice to hear from my friend Brian Pease as well, and tell us more stories. And the opportunity that I wanted to speak to you about was our opportunity, our chance together as a team to provide a place where these stories can live. And so I wanted to spend a few minutes with you updating you on our plans to build a new facility at Camp Ripley. So thank you, Stephen, for the opportunity. And we'll for a moment just send a note of appreciation to Stephen and Carol and Ken and others who have been leading this symposium for so many years. Don't take it for granted. If you're online and watching, we as a community of Minnesotans need to make sure that this kind of collaboration continues. And we're kind of counting on it with your help to build a new museum outside the wall of Camp Ripley. We'll show a few slides to you here to update you about where we are in this process. Right now, this is just outside the wall of Camp Ripley, north of Little Falls. You'll see Highway 371 on the right-hand side there, but right now it's an empty field, but key and pivotal for us is traffic. Traffic moving from Minneapolis to the Brainerd Lakes area, and Highway 371 is the artery to make that happen. So where we have been for 40 years has served us well, our partnership with Camp Ripley for sure, but the chance to move to this new site, 32 acres in size, just outside the walls of Camp Ripley and immediately adjacent to Highway 371 is priceless for us, because that exposure to our new facility on this large tract of land that was donated to us by a veteran is key. And so this will be our home in the near future. This might look a little blurry on your respective screens that I'm sharing with you, but maybe most exciting in all of this is that we'll talk for a moment about what's going on inside the museum itself, the galleries, and there's a dedicated Civil War gallery that we're going to need a lot of help with, including folks on this call moving forward. But also important to note that 32 acres is a large footprint. And I'm excited just about the possibility of working with Arn Kind and others to take full use of this property. Some of the property is going to be fully developed and all, but other areas will be not developed that will allow us to do all kinds of reenactments, I'm hoping, including Civil War reenactments on this site. So one, it's terrific to have the land, have it be in a position where lots of people will see what we're doing there, and nothing can be more compelling than to see a Civil War reenactment playing out right there for people to see. And you'll note on the diagram here, just for reference at least, the Mississippi River is the blue spot on the left-hand side of your page. Between the river and our 32 acres, that sliver of land right along the highway, is the cemetery, which will be another opportunity for us to collaborate with the folks at the cemetery. If you haven't been there, it's a beautiful site, is well used, and we want to be a good partner with them as well. To update you just kind of where we're at, this museum is being built. There's no question about that. And that came into fruition when the state legislature appropriated $13 million for the construction of this site. So that's done. And moving forward, we're meeting with architects soon. We submitted proposals and bids are coming in. So that $13 million will build a facility, and we'll show you a rendering in just a minute. received an additional $3 million in private funding. The private funds that we're looking to secure, $8 million in total, is going to outfit this facility with those gallery spaces and with education classrooms and other things. So there's no doubt that building is being built, and now we're doing private fundraising. Our board especially is leading that effort to bring in the kind of dollars that we want to have to make sure that these gallery spaces, the education classrooms, are really top notch. What that will buy us, essentially, by the state of Minnesota, is about a 40,000 square foot facility. So it's going to have a presence there, no doubt, on those 32 acres. We're going to continue to be good collaborators with Camp Ripley. You know, we want to be a regional resource and have every intention of forging a national reputation and partnering with lots of folks, including, you know, Gettysburg, the World War I Museum, World War II museums, and the like. So we'll have a presence, I think, statewide and nationwide. Timeline, groundbreaking next fall, and then a grand opening, spring of 2024. For what it's worth, I'm happy to put out there that we'd love to host the symposium moving forward. So give us a chance and count us in as a willing partner. We can make this happen, and that's a big commitment of what we want to do at the facilities: host symposiums, host veteran reunions, and other things that are going on. A rendering of the building. This is conceptual in nature, so the actual building won't look exactly like this, but it'll move in this direction as far as the size of it and kind of how it's oriented on that site plan that I showed you. A parade ground is something that we're committed to having because it allows us to do lots of things and do some formal things on those acres, but also north of that spot. If you go back to the rendering that I showed you, the site plan, there's all kinds of acreage that's undeveloped. So some formal presentation areas and other areas where we can dig a World War I trench or host a Civil War reenactment on this site too. But the idea is, again, to be a regional resource for people. We're also doing some other things. Stephen had mentioned the World War I Roundtable, taking the lead from the Civil War roundtables that have done such an amazing job over the years. We do host a monthly World War I roundtable. We also host a post 9/11 roundtable coming up this month. We have two of them, actually. One of them is speaking with Scott Wallace, who was in the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Scott is a veteran himself. He'll be speaking virtually. And then also joining him will be Mariah Jacobson. Mariah Jacobson is Tom Burnett's daughter. As you know, Tom Burnett was aboard Flight 93. So we're trying to do big things now while leading into even bigger plans to open a new facility in 2024. But to do that, you know, we will have a dedicated Civil War gallery. We'll have an additional gallery space, which is temporary, where we can bring in new exhibit items and showcase new things throughout the year. So we'll be looking to work with all of you in the future to define what does this space look like and how can we do right by Minnesota's Civil War legacy by having a permanent home that I think will be a significant attraction and resource for people in central Minnesota and really statewide. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Randall. We certainly look forward to the new facility and that dedicated Civil War gallery. And I would just encourage all of you in Minnesota's roundtables to think about potential corporate sponsors for those galleries or to help us build out galleries in that museum. And please get in touch with me or get in touch with Randall, and we will send out a formal request to any of those corporations or other entities that may have an interest in supporting this new facility. As you know, some of us have been a little concerned about the Minnesota Historical Society's commitment to military history over the last decade or so. It seems to have shifted to other interests. And so the Minnesota Military and Veterans Museum is really ready, able, and willing to pick up the mantle of preserving our state's military history. Thanks again, Randall.
Thank you.
Our next presentation is titled Legislating the Soldier Vote. And we are still on time. How about that? Rebecca Rubenstein has served as an election judge in Ramsey County for nearly 20 years. While assembling a database of Civil War soldiers' burial sites, She became interested in Civil War era election law. She also worked in 2015 as a research assistant for the production of Civil War Homecoming, A View from Minnesota on the War and its Aftermath, a co-sponsored production by the Minnesota Historical Society and Minnesota Public Radio. Rebecca.
Thank you, Steve. Many Minnesotans know that, can you hear me? I'm good? Okay. Many Minnesotans know that this state volunteered the first regiments for the Union in the Civil War. But every Minnesotan should know that our state invented the mail-in absentee ballot to allow these soldiers to vote. This revolutionary law extended to soldiers a means of voting that most citizens would not share until the 20th century. The law provided for uniform government-issued ballots, secrecy envelopes in which to place the ballots, and oaths attesting to the validity of the vote, witnesses to observe the voting process, and prepaid postage to send the ballot home. All elements we recognize as integral to absentee voting in this country. There were even provisions for allowing non-registered soldiers to register and vote simultaneously. During the legislative session in 1860, Minnesota passed major election reform. One key element of this law was a statewide system of voter registration. These reforms took effect at the election later that year. Spring of 1861 saw the legislative session end right before the outbreak of the Civil War, in an off year for national elections. As the war began in April, few citizens, not even Governor Alexander Ramsey, believed the conflict would last long. Our soldiers enlisted for 3 months, then 6, but few people expected service to extend past the autumn. When state and local elections rolled around in October of 1861, many people held the view that soldiers enlisted in service to the government willingly and knowingly gave up their right to vote while in service and away from home. Other government officers, including legislators and judges in many states, made this same sacrifice in the name of fulfilling their civic duty. One widespread view held that soldiers in particular should not vote at all because military service by its nature deprived them of their free will, an element vital to open democratic elections. In Minnesota, one officer, Reverend Thomas Inman, Captain Company D of the 4th Minnesota Infantry, a Baptist minister in Stearns County, believed he could serve his country both as a soldier and as an elector. He insisted on voting before traveling from St. Cloud to Fort Snelling for induction. The polls opened early to accommodate him and his fellow soldiers. When the election for Stearns County Treasurer was contested in the case of Tenvord versus Proctor, the court ruled that opening the polls early violated election law and that the soldiers should have been denied the right to vote. While Captain Inman's case garnered little attention outside of St. Cloud, the idea of soldiers voting gained traction in the spring of 1862, driven by several factors. First and foremost, the war not only continued, it intensified. This required a sharp increase in the number of troops volunteering for service. Enlistments climbed sharply. Second, the autumn congressional election became a referendum on the war. Both anti-war Democrats and pro-Union Republicans believed the soldiers' sentiments matched their own. In Minnesota, the 6th through the 10th regiments entered service that summer. With voting limited to males over 21, anywhere from a quarter to a third of our voting population found itself scattered across the country away from their polling districts. Minnesota's Constitution, Article 7, Section 3, stated that for the purpose of voting, no person shall be deemed to have lost a residence by reason of his absence while employed in the service of the United States. So soldiers had the right to vote in their home precinct, regardless of their location on election day. A slightly different situation existed for soldiers in Pennsylvania. At the start of the war, only Pennsylvania had a state law permitting soldiers to vote while away from home in military service. A relic of the War of 1812, the law allowed regiments to appoint officers as election judges, cast ballots, and transmit the results back home. Soldiers used this law in the fall of 1861 to exercise their elective franchise. The contested election results arrived at the Pennsylvania Supreme Court in the case of Chase versus Miller. Justice George Woodward's decision, delivered in May of 1862, became the seminal case on soldier voting law during the Civil War. The Pennsylvania case hinged on both the system of voting provided to soldiers and a new state constitution adopted between the War of 1812 and the Civil War. The law permitted soldiers to erect a ballot box wherever they happened to be stationed, as long as they were far enough away from home to make the journey impractical, if not impossible. The new Constitution, written in 1838, stated that electors had to vote in the district in which they resided. That's a direct quote, in the district in which they resided. Justice Woodward, having worked on the committee which revised the Constitution, insisted the wording meant that no votes could be offered by any individuals who were not physically within the boundaries of their home precinct at the time they offered their votes. He stated further that having military personnel oversee elections, quote, would be to confound the first principles of the government, unquote. Meanwhile, in Minnesota, the legislative session of 1862 ended in March with no proposed bills providing for soldiers to vote while away from home. One paper suggested that such ideas floated around the Capitol, but nothing appears in the legislative record. By the summer of 1862, as the additional 5 regiments of soldiers entered service, the need for action felt acute. Governor Ramsey called a special session of the legislature, scheduled for September, specifically to address the need for a soldier voting law. Of course, by the time this legislature actually met, most people's attention had shifted to Western Minnesota and the hostilities now known as the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. While this dramatic development garnered the lion's share of the legislature's attention in the special session, the primary reason for and first order of business at the session was the soldier voting law. Notably, in April of 1861, after the outbreak of the Civil War, according to the St. Paul Daily Press on February 27, 1862, Governor Ramsey, unlike many governors in the Union, declined to call a special session of the legislature. The paper applauded his belief that the $20,000 required to fund the session was not a wise use of tax money. Passing the soldier voting bill in 1862, however, did meet this standard for both the governor and for the press. In this respect, Minnesota was not alone. Iowa and Wisconsin also called special sessions of their legislatures that fall to enact soldier voting laws. Rather, what distinguished Minnesota was both the innovative method of voting and the utter lack of controversy it engendered. Understanding the revolutionary nature of Minnesota's soldier voting law requires a little background in how Americans voted in the first half of the 19th century. For starters, the US Constitution says nothing about voting methods or procedures, leaving a patchwork of laws enacted by states. No state offered government-issued ballots. Individual parties printed tickets, usually in their respective newspapers, which voters cut out and brought to the polls. This presented problems for many soldiers, who may have had a ballot box set up for their regiment in the style of Pennsylvania's voting law, but little access to newspapers of any kind, much less one that matched their political views. Minnesota's law provided for ballots issued by the state, ensuring soldiers could vote in all the contested races for the candidates who matched their political views. There were no secret ballots. While many states had switched from voice votes to public meetings, the Australian voting system, which included standard ballots and voter privacy, did not find general acceptance in the United States until the 1890s. This meant a voter's ballot could be viewed, numbered, color-coded, announced, strung up, and known by all present at the poll. For most soldiers wishing to vote, this could be a risky proposition. Having views different from the commanding officer, let alone the commander-in-chief, risked retaliation in the form of furloughs, denied supplies, or even being sent to the front lines. Minnesota offered soldiers a secret ballot, providing cover for those holding dissenting views. Also, in the first half of the 19th century, states eliminated the property requirement for voting. This simultaneously extended the franchise across the economic spectrum and invested election judges with the power to decide who was and was not entitled to vote. Transporting this practice into the field, according to the Pennsylvania model, assumed most regiments had volunteers from a particular county or geographic area, and soldiers knew each other's eligibility. However, David Collins of Wayne State University noted that the ethos of caring more about fellow soldiers in the field than about election laws led to lax enforcement of voting qualifications. Minnesota's law removed this burden from the backs of soldiers and left it at home with precinct officials. As the ballots arrived through the mail, election judges used local knowledge of the soldiers' residence, age, and service to verify voter qualifications. Fortunately, Minnesota had a registration law in effect for a year before the soldier voting bill passed. So even these judges relied less on personal knowledge and more on the previous year's poll to determine elector eligibility. This also addressed Justice Woodward's concern about maintaining civilian oversight of the voting process. Justice Woodward's decision stated further, quote, "The ballot cannot be sent by mail or express, nor can it be cast outside of all of Pennsylvania districts and certified into the county where the voter has his domicile," unquote. Yet Minnesota constructed a law doing exactly that. Since Pennsylvania did not have a statewide voter registration system, they had no way to identify a soldier's residence in the precinct receiving the ballot. More important to this alternative approach, perhaps, is the growth of and faith in the Postal Service. On a state level, Minnesota law deemed Postal Service essential to municipal existence. Being a young state with population centers scattered along rivers, facilitated deliveries in a timely manner. At the national and international level, all mail destined for British North America, including territory controlled by the fur trading companies, had to pass through Minnesota on its journey north. Having a dependable postal service was vital to Minnesota's and the nation's economy and their political relations. Minnesota's youth and resourcefulness allowed for creation of a law impossible to imagine in older states. So what exactly did Minnesota's voting law say, and how did it work? At the legislative special session in the fall of 1862, Rufus J. Baldwin introduced in the House, and Francis R.E. Cornell ushered through the Senate, a bill which, on September 29, 1862, became an act to enable citizens of this state who are or may be engaged in the military or naval service of the United States to vote in the election districts where they reside at the general election to be held in the month of November 1862 and at all subsequent general elections during the continuance of the present war. The bill passed the House 30-6 and unanimously in the Senate. A few items to note from the title alone. The law extended to men in the Navy and had a sunset at the end of the war. Most states, if they eventually passed a law allowing soldiers to vote, neglected to include sailors. Iowa, which passed its law right before Minnesota, fell into this category. And while Minnesota's law set a precedent for how to structure absentee voting, the privilege only extended to the military and vanished in 1865. Section 1 of the Act laid out the qualifications of voters entitled to this privilege: that they be enlisted, eligible to vote, and a resident of the voting district for 10 days before enlisting. It then goes on to include anyone who is a resident of a voting district before enlisting and had since become a legal voter by virtue of age. The legal voting age was 21, and the age of enlistment was 18. So this could apply to large numbers of enlisted men. The few states that followed Minnesota's absentee voting model generally excluded anyone who became eligible after leaving the voting district. Connecticut, for example, required these men to return home on a furlough to vote. But as Minnesota had a statewide voter registration law since 1860, which provided for same-day registration, election judges easily incorporated these newly eligible voters into the electorate. Section 2 of the bill addressed how soldiers cast their ballots. The ballot could be printed or written, or partly printed and partly written. This wording mirrored the civilian election rules. Remembering that most voters came to the polls with a pre-printed ballot provided by one of the political parties, this provision allowed a voter to erase names from the pre-printed ballot and write in different ones. In other words, Minnesotans had the option of crossing party lines. The soldier then folded the ballot, inserted it into an envelope, and sealed it with wax. All the materials being provided at taxpayers' expense and carried by state commissioners dispatched for this purpose. Upon the envelope, the soldier wrote the address of the local post office in his home precinct, his name and unit, and acknowledged that to be his, quote, free and voluntary, unquote, vote. The soldier then presented the envelope with the ballot sealed inside to a commissioner who administered an oath to the soldier, requiring him to swear that he did indeed meet all the qualifications of a legal voter. Section 3 directed on the back of the envelope, the commissioner receiving the ballot had to fill in his own name, the date, the unit, the soldier's name, and certify the soldier's identity and free will in casting the ballot. Crucially, Section 3 ended with a note that, quote, his vote shall be received, notwithstanding he may have been challenged before the judges of election, unquote. This meant that once the soldier completed the voting process and sent the ballot home, there was no way to prevent his vote from being counted. In fact, Section 5 in the law, in directing the judges in how to make the voter registry ahead of the election, specifically states, quote, any absent elector whose vote shall be received by such judges, accompanied with the certificate of the oath provided by Section 3 of the Act, shall be inserted in said registry on the day of election, and such elector shall be allowed to vote, whether challenged under this act or not, unquote. Should subsequent investigating reveal illegal voting, Minnesota election law provided penalties for that. Section 4 says, quote, the person desiring to vote shall then deposit the said envelope, sealed, directed, endorsed, and certified as aforesaid, with said commissioners, who shall deposit the same with the postage prepaid in any post office, unquote. On the other end of the vote, the law states, quote, the judges, upon receiving the said envelope, shall keep the same unopened until the opening of the polls at the said election, when they shall examine the registry list of their district, and upon finding the name of the person endorsed upon such envelope on such registry list, they shall open the said envelope, and unless the person whose name is endorsed upon the envelope shall have died after certifying the same, shall deposit the ballot contained therein, unopened, in the proper box or boxes, and canvass the same with the other votes cast at such election, in no way distinguishing the same from the other votes cast, unquote. In this section, we can easily recognize the birth of familiar absentee voting process. The secrecy of the vote extended all the way from the voter's hand to the ballot box. While intermediaries may handle the envelope containing the ballot, at no time is the vote known to anyone except the elector. Section 8 of the Act imposed a felony, including prison time, for up to a year, and fines of at least $500 for anyone who tampered with a ballot in transit. In this way, the Minnesota law circumvented constitutional provisions that hampered other states' efforts to pass soldier voting laws. The idea that a vote would be cast in the district in which the elector resided, the center of Judge Woodward's decision in Pennsylvania, eliminated the possibility of voting outside the state. But Minnesota's law reinterpreted casting a ballot. The vote was cast not when leaving the voter's hand, but upon reaching the ballot box, envisioning a pipeline whereby a vote signed, sealed, and endorsed in one state was deposited unmolested in a ballot box in another state, a vote could be cast in the home election district, though actually voted hundreds of miles away. Also in this section, we see the creation of a paper trail to minimize potential fraud. With all the voting materials originating in the hands of a government-appointed commissioner, obtaining more than one ballot posed a challenge. But on the off chance that a soldier tried to vote more than once, his efforts would be thwarted back home, where the election judges had a registry of names, a stack of mailed ballots, and the discretion to accept only one vote per elector. For any ballots that arrived from soldiers whose names did not appear on the registry, there is a paper trail for that too. New York also tried to create a paper trail for its soldiers using proxy voting. Their soldiers named a person back home to cast the vote, then sent the ballot to that person, who in turn took the ballot to the polling place and deposited it. Not only did this create extra work for the soldiers, who had to grant the powers of attorney ahead of time, but the use of an intermediary masked ballot tampering. In fact, one of the few cases of voter fraud successfully prosecuted during the Civil War involved ballots heading for their proxies opened by Democratic operatives who swapped Democratic ballots for Republican ballots during the presidential election in 1864. Significantly, Minnesota's paper trail ended once a ballot reached the election judges. Most discussions of voting during the Civil War focused not on the methods used, but on the results. Were soldiers Democrats hoping for an end to the war, or Republicans fighting for the Union? Did they blindly support Lincoln as commander-in-chief, or did they prefer McClellan, a fellow soldier? Did their votes determine the results of the election? For states using the Pennsylvania election model, these effects could be easily known and indeed formed the basis of many lawsuits. In Minnesota, the law strictly forbade any system of knowing how the soldier voted. Their ballots were received, opened, and deposited without in any way being distinguished. And if their vote showed a preference or determined a race, we can't know. All we could possibly know is how many soldiers voted. By all accounts, soldier access to voting, as reflected in the number of votes received by the commissioners, was the largest failing of Minnesota's Soldier Voting Act. The original law provided for 3 sets of 2 commissioners each set containing a representative from each major political party. One set of commissioners stayed in Minnesota to collect the votes of soldiers within the state, while the other 2 sets divided up the rest of the country as directed by the law. With only a month between the passage of the law and the election, it is easy to see the challenges these commissioners faced. In fact, one of the only changes to the original bill as it made its way through the legislature was to move the election back from October to November in order to facilitate the commissioners' travels. Still, the time constraints left many soldiers unvisited, their votes uncollected. In response, in March of 1863, the legislature passed a resolution appointing 2 additional sets of commissioners to collect soldier votes. Even with 5 teams of commissioners, The following letter illustrates the frustration the commissioners felt. In a letter from Governor and former election commissioner Stephen Miller to Colonel William Marshall on November 12, 1864, quote, "I am terribly mortified that our brave men of the 2nd, 5th, 7th, 9th, and 10th regiments did not obtain an opportunity to vote. Assure them that I made every possible effort to reach them, both in Arkansas and Missouri, and that I will labor faithfully for such an amendment to the law during the next session as will reach every soldier belonging to the state in the future," unquote. Of course, by the election of 1865, Robert E. Lee had surrendered, marking the official end of the war, and with it, the end of the soldier voting law. So what is the legacy of the soldier voting law? By the end of the Civil War, most states had provided for soldiers to vote while on duty. Most of them followed the original Pennsylvania model, but 6, Connecticut, Illinois, New York, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and West Virginia, adopted laws similar to Minnesota. Like Minnesota, however, most states sunsetted their soldier voting laws when the Civil War ended. Not until the immense deployment of soldiers during the First World War did states revisit the need to allow soldiers to vote while deployed. Against this backdrop, in 1915, Josiah Benton wrote his crucial analysis of Civil War voting, titled "Voting in the Field." In it, he discusses Minnesota's law in a scant 6 pages, then dismissed it because the soldiers did not actually vote in the field, and no results of the votes existed. In 1902, in Australia, and in 1914, North Dakota, laws appeared that allowed for mail-in absentee voting. As the practice became entrenched and expanded after the war, few people remembered Minnesota's law of 1862. This lack of credit reflects several things: the unknown effect of the soldier vote on election outcomes, the relatively small number of soldiers serving from Minnesota, and the absence of controversy surrounding the law. As a general rule, the idea of soldiers voting did not become a partisan issue until 1863, after the Democrats made significant gains in Congress in 1862. By passing the law in 1862, Minnesota escaped the national political spotlight cast upon states like Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. The question of the constitutionality of Minnesota's law arose as the bill progressed through the legislature. The House offered a motion to seek an opinion from the Supreme Court as to the constitutionality of the law, but that fell to defeat 16-3. The Senate sent the bill to its Judiciary Committee, but the head of that committee was the same Senator Cornell who introduced the bill to that legislative body. The bill breezed through committee. The only election whose results might have been contested on the basis of the soldier vote was the 2nd District congressional race between William J. Cullen and Ignatius Donnelly. Cullen, the Democrat, initially wanted to contest the result. However, contesting soldier voting became increasingly toxic for Democrats in Minnesota and nationwide by 1863. so he decided not to pursue the contest. With no constitutional or legal challenges, no contested elections, and broad-based bipartisan support for its precedent-setting law, Minnesota soldiers proved that secret ballots, absentee voting, and the post office could be integral parts of free, fair, and honest elections. In Ohio's case of Lehman versus McBride, the Supreme Court's decision in December of 1863 included the assertion, quote, "It must be conceded that in authorizing elections to be held outside of the state, it may be found difficult to protect the independence of voters, to scrutinize thoroughly the right of all who claim to be entitled to the elective franchise, to prevent frauds at elections and in the returns thereof, and preserve their purity by the infliction of penalties upon the perpetrators of fraudulent acts, and to surround the exercise of this important franchise with all the safeguards which might be thought advisable." Minnesota's Civil War soldier voting law clearly addressed these concerns and set an example for other states to follow.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was a very timely presentation, given news that we've all had to endure for the last few months regarding some of these same very issues. It's really quite refreshing to know that Minnesota was at the forefront of the whole development of the absentee voting system and mail-in ballots. And some of those issues are still being contested now. We have time for probably one question. If anyone has a question, please unmute and ask Rebecca your question. We have about 5 minutes. Last call.
Yes, I do have a question. Rebecca told us that there were significant penalties or laws against cheating, etc. Do you know if there's ever been cases that were enacted where people were found guilty and penalized?
In the Civil War? Because
Or
Minnesota,
any time afterwards. Let's not the last 6 or 7 months, but before that.
yeah, Minnesota usually has a 3 to 5, maybe 10 cases every year where there are contested cases, but it's really, really rare.
I have a question. I have a question.
Mhm.
I understood that when you walk up to get your ballot, they ask, do you want a Republican or Democrat, or who do you want one for? Then they give you a right there, and then you take it over there and vote it. Isn't that true? People are asked, who do you want to vote for? When you ask,
Not in Minnesota, no.
nowhere else, maybe.
And back in the time of the Civil War, you had to procure your own ballot. So there'd be party operatives out there handing out ballots to the people they wanted to vote. So, yeah, and sometimes they'd even be watching the polls to see which ballot you put in the box, if they happen to have color coded it, or if they could tell by the appearance of the ballot which party you were voting for. But
The fellow down in Owatonna has some ballots, and they aren't elected. They aren't marked a little X in them. And that's when they explained, hey, you just ask, who do you want one for? The fellow there in Owatonna, Stephen, you know him? Rick?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So that's,
Saw him last weekend.
oh,
But you're talking about Civil War ballots, correct?
right, yes, Civil War ballots.
Right.
I'll ask
But
Yeah.
that.
that apparently was not the case for absentee mail-in ballots from Civil War soldiers.
And it wasn't the case for civilian ballots either. It was definitely, you're correct, it was definitely a party vote. You got either a Republican or a Democratic ballot or a Whig ballot before that. But you generally had to procure your own, which was one of the challenges that soldiers faced because there were no people providing them the ballots.
Interesting history there.
Okay, well, thank you, Rebecca. That was excellent. The next little segment that we have here is an introduction from the Minnesota Civil War Roundtables. And Dan, for some reason, your face was still on my screen, so why don't you unmute and let's start with the Cannon Valley Civil War Roundtable.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Just our Civil War Roundtable, Cannon Valley, the Cannon River, and everything else here is named Cannon. And we meet once a month, third Thursday of every month. A dozen or two come every meeting. And we usually have a little coffee, and we meet in Northfield and the senior citizen. We haven't met since February. I'll make this quick. And our next one that keeps on waiting, keep ready to go. I talked to him last month, and that was John Kane of Red Wing, and he's going to talk about the many Confederate flags that they had, and you read stuff about that every day or every once in a while. It'll be a very interesting meeting if we can someday have it. Maybe not till August or September. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. And let's move to the Twin Cities Civil War Roundtable. Robert, you still on?
Yes, I'm still here.
Go
And
ahead.
we're going to have a real live meeting come the 18th of May, and full plated dinner. And we're going to hear about the Dakota Indian trials.
Okay, thank you. Rochester Civil War Roundtable. Anybody like to speak up from that organization? The Rochester Roundtable meets at 7 p.m. the second Wednesday of each month at the Olmsted County History Center, which is located in Rochester. And their contact is their president, Richard Crome. I have his contact information that I can certainly share if anyone would be interested. Moving on to the St. Croix Valley Civil War Roundtable. Anybody like to speak up for that organization? That group meets at 5:30 p.m. the fourth Monday of each month at the Lowell Inn in Stillwater. You can get information on their meetings from Steve Anderson, who's sort of the institutional memory of the organization, or from David Page, who is this year's president of the organization. They also have their schedule on their website, www.scvcwrt.org, St. Croix Valley Civil War Roundtable.org. And Central Minnesota Civil War Roundtable, Wynn, I saw your name on the screen a minute ago. Are you still there?
I am here and I'm very much enjoying the presentation. And I want you to know that as a teacher, having to Zoom again, it's a complete testament of my love for Civil War symposiums that you would get me on Zoom on a Saturday. So hats off to all of you. I am so zoomed out, you can only imagine. We are hoping to start up again in the fall. We meet at the Stearns County History Museum. In addition to members' concerns about meetings, we were also stymied by the museum's internal policies. So this summer I will get in touch with them and hopefully we can be up and running again, most likely the second Tuesday of the month at 3 p.m. as always. So like I do in person, if any of you want to speak to the group, just let me know. I'm always looking for speakers. So thank you very much.
And you're still meeting at the Stearns History Museum in St. Cloud, correct?
Correct.
Good. Okay. Anybody here from the Hiawatha Valley Civil War Roundtable in Winona? That group meets at 7 p.m. the second Thursday of each month at the Watkins Manor on Wabasha Street in Winona. And you can get information from Scott Fabian or from Rick Bessinger, both on the board of that organization. They do have a schedule, but they don't have it up online. So you have to contact them to get their schedule of speakers. Anyone from the Minnesota Valley Civil War Roundtable in New Ulm?
Yeah, I can comment there. We have nothing planned at all. Hopefully, we meet in the library, and hopefully by fall, we'll probably be starting up again.
Okay, and I think the library is handling your publicity and will publish a schedule of your programs. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so you can just Google the New Ulm Public Library and check their monthly calendar to see any presentations of the Minnesota Valley Civil War Roundtable coming up starting this fall, we hope. Anybody from the Albert Lee Civil War Roundtable want to speak up? That organization meets at 7 p.m. the first Thursday at the Brookside Education Center in Albert Lee. And for information, you can contact Jim Munier, and I have his email address. They don't have a website right now, but he can provide you with a schedule of their upcoming programs, again, probably starting in the fall. And finally, the Litchfield GAR Civil War Roundtable. Anybody want to speak up about that organization?
Well, this is Gary Blessman. I've been a member there for 3 years, and we are resuming our in-person meetings in May, and I'm the speaker. And we have been meeting off and on via Zoom and a couple times in person following the governor's mandate. So we are functioning, and we'd invite you to Litchfield. If you haven't visited there, the GAR Hall is a treasure.
And you're one of the roundtables that meets during the day at
That is correct.
1:30 p.m. the second Thursday. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I
And it
drive
is
75 minutes to get there.
Beautiful, easy drive out to Litchfield. I've done it
That's
a number of times to
correct.
speak. And you also have the perk of being able to speak from a platform and in a hall where all kinds of Civil War heroes gave presentations 100 years ago and earlier on some of the same subjects that we talk about now in their memory. So it's a wonderful place to visit and well worth the drive out there. And I'm keeping a master list of the Minnesota Civil War roundtables. There are 9 of them right now that are still active. So if any of you are members and hear of any changes or a website being developed or a list of programs being published, please let me know or let the Twin Cities Civil War Roundtable know through their website, and we will make sure that that word gets around to everybody. I think there is a good reason for all of us to stay in touch, both in terms of sharing speakers, sharing information about events that may be in regional parts of the state, and any initiatives that might be coming up, like plans for the new Minnesota Military and Veterans Museum up at Camp Ripley and their Civil War Gallery. So do keep your information current. And if anyone would like a copy of this information, I'd be happy to send it out. And with that, I think we're ready to move up to our final talk of the day. And that talk is on technology and the Civil War, presented by my old friend Arn Kind. And Arn has been an educator for 46 years now. And could you all please mute your, probably including you, Arn, right now, because I'm getting feedback. Thank you. Arn Kind has been an educator for 46 years. 36 of those years have been in the public schools. After retiring in 2013, he founded Historical Experiences, an organization which has him touring the state, sharing his love of history with people of all ages in a multitude of venues, from library and classroom seminars at elementary, middle, and high schools to immersive lectures at the university level, as well as summer camps, libraries, veterans groups, historical societies, reenactments, and festivals. Arn, take her away.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I was, when Steve told me he wanted me to present at this and said, he's got this big hook. And if you go over time, he grabs you by the neck and pulls you out. And that's when we're going to be face to face. But now he doesn't have his hook and he can't really hurt me anymore. So I'm just warning you, Steve, you're probably gonna have to cut me off. I took my original Civil War technology presentation, which is usually 441 slides, and I cut 66 slides out of it. And the reason I have so many slides is, first of all, I'm an educator. I believe in a lot of visual aids. And secondly, my father could not enjoy my presentations because he's stone deaf. And so I put my text right on the slides. And so in order to do that, you have to have a lot of pictures. Otherwise, you bore people with a slide that's going to take you 30 minutes to get through the text on it. So this is on Civil War technology. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully I'm doing this right. Everybody can see that. How's that look to everybody? Looking good? All right, Civil War technology. This is also about a president's fascination with technology, because Lincoln did have a fascination with new inventions and with technology. By the 1800s, technology had already begun changing work, transportation, education, and many parts of life in America. The Industrial Revolution was already underway in England while Abraham Lincoln was growing up, and it would change the lives of people around the globe. Lincoln had a 5-year-old son named Robert. Abraham wanted to show him what technology was bringing to America. So one day in 1848, when Lincoln was a first-term U.S. congressman from Illinois, he brought Robert to the Patent Office building. There, father and son enjoyed looking at all the detailed small-scale models of the ideas people had for new inventions and technology. Sometime after their visit to the Patent Office, Lincoln was aboard a river steamboat when it ran aground and had a heck of a time trying to get off a bar and underway again. This inspired Lincoln to come up with a solution to this not so infrequent problem. He came up with the idea for a device that could be attached to the sides of the ship. Filling these devices with air would lift the ship and allow it to float and travel over a shallow stretch of water. Lincoln, an excellent whittler, made a wooden model of his idea, presented it to a patent lawyer who wrote up the necessary legal papers and sent them and the model off to the Patent Office. On May 22nd, 1842, the model earned Abraham Lincoln patent number 6469 for, I quote, a device for buoying vessels over shoals. Lincoln is the only president, to my knowledge, to have ever been granted a patent. Lincoln understood the importance of inventions and patents like his to the country. He was quoted as saying, "Patents secured to the inventor for a limited time the exclusive use of his invention, and thereby added the fuel of interest to the fire of genius in the discovery and production of new and useful things." A little over a decade later, as president during the Civil War, he would see the military importance of the telegraph and railroads and many other new and useful things long before his generals did. President Lincoln knew that winning the war would take more than the same old strategies and maneuvers. It would require using technology to create new ways of waging war. Lincoln had always been fascinated with the latest inventions and new technologies. This interest would influence him when he worked to make sure that his soldiers and sailors had the best and latest hardware. He witnessed high-powered weapons testing at the Navy Yard. He used the telegraph to keep in constant contact with his generals. Lincoln approved plans for ironclad warships and the launch of surveillance balloons. And he ordered railroads to transport troops and supplies. By combining new tools of war with time-tested tactics, the Union would eventually win the war. Let's start with weapons, a good place to start as far as technology in the Civil War goes. Now, when you talk about technology, you can't appreciate the modern technology of the time without looking at what came before. So we're going to start out with Revolutionary War era muskets. And this is the round musket ball here. Pre-Civil War cartridges look like this between a round ball and a buck and ball and shot. Making musket balls, of course, back then was very primitive. You would take lead, molten lead, you'd pour it into a mold. You'd allow it to cool just a bit, and then you would knock off the sprue, as this gentleman is doing, drop it in the water to cool it, and that was done for every musket ball. The loading of a Revolutionary War musket is important to understand that, so you understand the percussion system that we're going to be talking about. How does a flintlock firearm work? Well, let's look at first of all, the lock of a a flintlock. You've got the lock, you've got the jaw screw, and what we're going to be doing is, first of all, we're going to be tearing a paper cartridge. We're going to be pouring the paper into a pan, and then we're going to shut the pan. And then when we pull back the hammer, first of all, I should show you this picture here, which shows you what the pan looks like from above. It's important that you look at this picture and see a little hole next to the pan, which is the vent. When the flint comes down, it hits a steel frizzen. You can see that the jaws are holding the flint, and when the trigger is pulled, the hammer falls forward, it hits the steel frizzen. When a steel frizzen is in contact with flint, you get sparks. Those sparks will drop into the powder pan, and we hope that that fire is going to go through the vent and ignite the main powder charge.
And push the frizzen up and out of the way, and the frizzen is going to pivot along this hinge here. So as it pivots up and out of the way, it's going to uncover the pan, which inside the pan, we're going to find the priming charge. This is a separate charge from the powder charge, the main powder charge inside the barrel. And as the sparks are being created with the interaction of the flint striking the steel, those sparks will now enter into the pan. And ideally, we're going to see it ignite the primer charge in the pan, as we see there. Now, how it's going to get inside the barrel is this hole here. This is known as the touch hole. It is a hole that's drilled inside the barrel that's going to allow the burning primer compound to go into that little hole, vent inside it, and ignite the main powder charge.
All right. This is my friend, Spence Johnson. He's going to demonstrate the loading and firing of a Revolutionary musket by the manual, and I'll just go through the commands here. First command is open pan and half-cocked musket. Next command is handle cartridge. Then it's tear cartridge. Tear the paper tail off, exposing the powder. Prime, he pours a little bit of the powder, but not all of it, into the pan. Next command is shut pan. And then he goes he casts about, pours the rest of the powder down the muzzle. This is called charge firelock. He then grabs the tulip end of the ramrod. Next command is draw rammer. Next command is ram down cartridge. He rams that round ball, 69 caliber or 75 caliber, depending on his musket, down the barrel and seats it on top of the powder. Now he's at return rammer. He goes back up to the shoulder, firelock. Next command is poise your firelock. And then it's make ready. And then take aim and fire. Those are the steps of loading and firing a Revolutionary War musket. Now, one thing that's important to understand with the Revolutionary War musket is they are smooth bores. There's no rifling inside the barrel. There's also a lot of windage between the ball and the bore of the barrel. Windage is the space between the diameter of the projectile, the musket ball you're firing, and the actual bore inside of the barrel. You want a certain amount of windage because if you didn't, that would be a hard ball to ram down and would take you much longer to load your musket. And so that would be less firepower for you. But the problem with windage is that ball, as you can see from my illustration, is going to bounce up and down all the way down the barrel. And that's going to affect it. However it bounced just before it left that barrel is going to affect its trajectory after it leaves the barrel. Plus, with windage, you lose a large force of the explosion from the powder that set that ball down the length of the barrel, because some of the force of that powder, some of the gases are going to be escaping around the ball, and that's going to affect your range. It's going to limit your range. A new basketball ball looks like this right out of the mold. Here's one that's oxidized after it's been in the air for a little bit. Now, these musket balls may look perfectly round when you take them out of the mold, but they're not. Sometimes the abnormality, the imperfection of the ball is very obvious. At other times it's not. It may be invisible because maybe one part of the lead is a little bit denser than the other part of the lead. But the one thing is true for sure, the imperfection of the ball will affect its trajectory as it leaves the muzzle of the barrel. The imperfection of the ball affects its trajectory. So you can see we got the windage. This is looking right down the barrel of a gun, and you can see the ball's got a lot of space or windage around it. So it's going to be bouncing as it comes out that barrel. If a ball is heavy on the right side, it will move in the direction of that imperfection. If the ball is heavy on the left side, it will move in the direction of that imperfection. These dug up relics from Revolutionary War battlefields clearly show the imperfection of the round balls. Most Revolutionary War muskets were not accurate beyond 80 yards. That isn't even the length of a football field. Tactics then were dictated by the limitations of the smoothbore musket. As troops could not be expected to hit a specific target at any appreciable range, the soldiers were packed tightly together, shoulder to shoulder, and in two ranks to concentrate their firepower. As the troops all fired at the same time in what were called volleys, they would send a hail of lead downfield toward the enemy. It was hoped that their volleys of musket fire would be devastating enough to break up the enemy formation. They could then be pushed from the field with the bayonet. Here's an example of how close the two sides had to be to become within effective range of the musket fire. Then along came an invention that changed infantry warfare. How's that for a fun way to show rifling? Rifling comes along, which is a spiral groove which is carved inside the barrel of a gun, which causes that projectile, round ball or conical in shape, to spin in a spiral. This is the Meunier ball. Everybody calls it mini ball. The correct pronunciation is Meunier because it was invented by Captain Claude Meunier, a French military man, in 1846. It was adapted for use by the US military in 1855. This is the makeup of a single cartridge. The cartridges were made out of paper, so they had to be kept dry. There's actually two paper tubes here, one inside the other. You can see where the mini ball, or the Meunier ball, is in the front of the cartridge, and behind it are 60 grains of black powder. 10 paper cartridges per package, along with 11 or 12 percussion caps in each package. The percussion cap replaced the flint and frizzen ignition system. Each percussion cap has a compound called fulminate of mercury inside it. When the trigger is pulled, the hammer comes down on the percussion cap, which explodes a shot of fire down the vent hole to the main powder charge, which ignites, propelling the ball out of the barrel. Now, instead of loading a round ball, a conical shaped Meunier ball is rammed down on top of the powder charge. Take note of the hollow cavity inside the skirt of the bottom of the projectile. This is a cutaway view of the breech of the gun barrel. Notice the soldier's already put the black powder down the bottom. And notice the caliber of the bore. This is a 58 caliber bore, which means it's 580 thousandths of an inch across the diameter of the bore. The 5.77 Meunier ball now is rammed down the .580 barrel and seated on the powder charge of black powder. Notice that the ball, the Meunier ball, is 5.77. There's windage between the Meunier ball and the bore. This windage allows the ball to easily slide down the barrel without getting stuck. This speeds up the process of loading. When the musket is fired, powder ignites, expanding the skirt of the Meunier ball. Notice now that the windage around the skirt has disappeared, and that's because the ball skirt is now the same caliber as the bore, 5.80. Now the skirt now pushes out against the spiral grooves, and as the ball is propelled down the barrel, the rifling spins the ball. Because the windage has been eliminated by the expanding skirt, no gases can escape from around the ball. That means that the full force of the exploding powder is harnessed to propel the ball down the field, greatly increasing the range. Because your projectile is now spinning, the imperfection of the ball is no longer on one side of the ball, but is rotating 360 degrees around the center of the projectile, with the net effect of balancing that projectile. You have in effect eliminated the imperfection by putting it on all sides of the projectile, resulting in a projectile whose trajectory is straight and true to where the soldier is aiming. Remember the hollow cavity inside the skirt of the Minier ball. It is filled with a coagulated animal fat or grease. Now, the extreme heat of the exploding powder charge instantly melts that animal fat, that grease, inside the skirt of the Minier ball. This spinning ball throws the melted fat out, lubricating the entire length of the barrel. This lubrication keeps the barrel from fouling with burnt powder and allows the next round to be rammed down with ease. This is the procedure that soldiers had to learn when they loaded their muskets. Loaded 9 times, it was called. And of course, when they were in the middle of a skirmish, they did this automatically. But when they're first trained, they had to follow each step precisely. This is loaded 9 times, according to the Hardy's and Casey's manual.
No position was as important as load in 9 times. The loading drill taught not only the steps in loading the musket, but for the officers, established a standard rate of fire for his men and his company. The drill would begin with the order:
Load in 9 times. Load.
the musket brought to the center of the feet in a snug but convenient location to handle the rammer and to place eyes on the muzzle. Hand to his cartridge box, which held the 40 hand-rolled paper rounds. With a cartridge between the thumb and pointer finger, place the cartridge to the mouth. Using teeth to open the powder end of the cartridge. Pull it to the front of the muzzle. Dumping the gunpowder down the barrel, then squeezing the bullet into the muzzle.
Draw rammer.
Placing the tulip or head of the rammer upon the point of the bullet.
Ram cartridge. Turn rammer.
In battle, many nervous soldiers would forget this and would shoot their rammers at the rebels.
Time.
The musket is now eased in front of the soldier. Muzzle down range at the height of the eye.
Shoulder. Arm.
In battle, every man was supposed to finish the loading process in 15 to 20 seconds. By the book, every man could shoot 3 rounds per minute. Each company of 90 muskets could fire 270 rounds per minute. Every regiment of 10 companies could fire 2,700 rounds per minute. By the Middle War period, the average strength of a regiment in the Army of the Potomac was 400 men. Firing 3 rounds per minute, a veteran regiment could easily expend 12,000 rounds in a 10-minute firefight. At the Battle of Gettysburg, the high tide of the war, Mr. Lincoln's Army of the Potomac had grown into a perfect killing machine.
And now we're going to talk about the carbines. Starting out with the Sharps rifle and carbine, it was a 52 caliber weapon, and you could fire 10 shots a minute as compared to 3 shots a minute with the muzzleloader. There's the lock, the breech block, and hammer of the Sharps rifle. And cocking the Sharps rifle would drop down the breech block. This is a breech loader compared to a muzzle loader. And when the breech block is dropped down, you actually loaded the Sharps rifle from the breech and then closed it which cut off the tail, just like the soldier cut off the tail with his teeth when he tore the cartridge. The Sharps does that, and then he would put a percussion cap on. You can see the percussion, the nipple in the inside of the breech there, where you would put the percussion cap.
The 52 caliber Sharps cartridge was made of nitrated linen or paper enclosing a 52 caliber conical lead ball. The Sharps cartridge was unique in that it could be loaded into the chamber breech. The lever could be brought up to seal the breech, and a priming pellet or percussion cap could be used to fire the cartridge. The easy loading and firing of the Sharps rifle made it one of the faster breech loaders of the Civil War.
A total of 9,141 Sharps rifles were purchased by the government during the war. This is in contrast to the 80,000 Sharps carbines purchased by the government during the war.
Loading the Sharps rifle from the prone position, of course, was much easier than trying to load a muzzle loader. And the Sharps was popular with Berdan's sharpshooters, the best shots in the Union Army. Here you can see the Sharps rifle seen alongside the 1861 Springfield musket. The Spencer repeating rifle then came out in 1860. The rifle was a manually operated lever action repeating rifle fed from a tube magazine firing 52 caliber bullets. It was adopted by the Union Army, especially by the cavalry during the American Civil War. It had a 7-shot magazine with cartridges, and spring-loaded magazine held 7 52 caliber Spencer rimfire cartridges. Cartridges were loaded with 45 grains of black powder. Here you can see the 7-shot magazine and how it fit into the butt of the Spencer stock. The shorter carbine was the weapon of choice for the Union cavalry. By the end of the war, the Spencer was the most widely used and sought-after breech loader of the war. There's the Spencer block, and a cutaway of the Spencer. You can see how the cartridges go up the stock and into the breech of the weapon. The only problem with this is you have to reload those magazines. They were 7-shot, would take you quite a while. You wouldn't want to have to do that in the middle of a firefight. So you carried the Blakesley cartridge box, which held 7-shot magazines, which could be pulled out and slammed down the stock very quickly.
Arguably the most effective weapon in the Civil War was the Spencer. It's invented by Christopher Spencer, Connecticut manufacturer. It could have been adopted by the Union in great numbers early in the war, but the very conservative chief of ordnance, James Wolfe Ripley, was concerned that the men would fire too much ammunition. It was too difficult for the men to handle. And Mr. Lincoln went out one day with Christopher Spencer out in back of the White House and actually fired the weapon. Now the Spencers come in 2 types, the carbine and the rifle. The action is the same. They both are 7-shot. The rifle has a longer barrel.
Every time I see Ed Barris now, I get a little cotton mouth and a little bit nervous, because the last time I spoke at the Twin Cities Civil War Roundtable, I was the main speaker for 1 month, and I looked at their programs for the previous meetings, and guess who the speaker was the month before? It was Edward Barris. How would you like to follow him as a speaker at the Twin Cities Civil War Roundtable? It was a little bit intimidating. Anyway, that's the infantry used the longer Spencer rifle. And this is what Edward Barris is talking about here. This is a dramatization from The Blue and the Gray of Christopher Spencer allowing President Lincoln to try out the Spencer. He, of course, is hoping to get a contract from the government. They don't allow firearms to be fired on the White House lawn anymore.
Fired those 7 rounds in 28 seconds, Mr. President. Barrel remains cool. Oh, that's not too bad, is it, Jonas? Good shooting, sir. Let's set the board back a little further there, back by the pine tree. Now, let's see what an expert can do, Jonas. This will be an excellent test of your invention, Mr. Spencer. Captain Steele here is an Army scout attached to General McClellan's staff and one of the best shots in the Army. Ready, sir? Ready. Fire. 16 seconds. Incredible. That is, if you hit anything. Well, what'd you think of it, Jonas? Well, she has well, sir. Lever action is smooth. Capability for rapid fire is amazing. That looks like you missed one. There'll have to be an official test, Mr. Spencer. I'll recommend to the War Department that they evaluate your rifle right away. You'll hear from them.
This is Buford's cavalry using their Spencers to hold off the Rebs in the first day of Gettysburg, and George Armstrong Custer doing the same. Benjamin Tyler Henry, the inventor of the first practical lever action repeating rifle that would outdo the Spencer. The fast shooting Henry was in great demand, 10,000 purchased by troops. The Henry fired 44 caliber, 216 grain bullets backed by 25 grains of powder. Henry's rifles, 15 shot magazine could be emptied in less than 11 seconds.
Firepower continued to improve when B. Tyler Henry invented a rapid fire rifle. From 1862 to 1866, 13,000 Henry repeater rifles were manufactured. Its rate of fire was up to 30 rounds per minute, with a range of 1,000 yards.
This is the Henry. It is a repeater. It's a 13 shot. To load it, slide the magazine follower all the way forward, unlock the magazine tube.
Its spring-loaded magazine used a fully self-contained rim-fire metallic cartridge.
You close it, hold your follower, all your ammunition down, lever the action, which will bring a shell up. So you already got another one in the chamber.
The soldiers were so enamored with the Henry rifle that they finally said you could load it on Sunday and fire it all week.
The Henry was expensive to buy, though, $42, but many soldiers felt the firepower was worth it and saved up their monthly pay to purchase one, figuring their chances of getting home were that much better. Let's talk about artillery now. The 12-pound Napoleon was the mainstay of both armies. The Napoleon was, like most guns, was used in the war. They were smoothbore cannon. Smoothbore projectiles were either shot or shell or grape shot or canister. And solid shot, of course, was exactly that. They were solid balls. Shells were hollow projectiles that had powder. If it was spherical, it just had powder inside. If there was a spherical case, you'll see that in the middle. Not only was there gunpowder inside, but all these small balls that would fly off in different directions. And then you had canister, which is used when infantry got close range, and that was canister. Case shot was used against naval targets and wasn't used a whole lot on land. There's, you see again, canister, spherical case, and solid shot with the powder bag strapped to it. Artillery caused only 5.5% of all battlefield deaths, but it was a terror to the infantry. Then they did the same thing they did to the smoothbore muskets they did to the cannon. They rifled the barrel, which greatly increased its accuracy and its range. The 3-inch ordnance rifle was the most widely used rifle gun during the war, invented by John Griffin. It was extremely durable, known for its reliability and accuracy. The 3-inch ordnance rifle was fielded by the artillery branches of both armies. Crafted from hammer-welded, machine-ironed, the ordnance rifle typically fired 8-pound or 9-pound shells, as well as solid shot, case, and canister. Captain Robert Parker, Parrott, created the first Parrott rifle and projectile. The cast iron construction made for an accurate gun, but was brittle enough to suffer fractures. Hence, a large wrought iron reinforcing band was overlaid on the breech to give it an additional strength. There were prior cannons designed this way, but the method of securing his band was the innovation that allowed the Parrott to overcome the deficiencies of these earlier models. It was applied to the gun red hot, and then the gun was turned while pouring water down the muzzle, allowing the band to attach uniformly. The 10-pounder Parrotts were used by both armies. The 20-pounder pictured above was the largest field gun used during the war. The barrel alone weighed 1,800 pounds. There's some of the rifled gun bolts and shells that were used in these rifled weapons and more. The breech-loading rifled Whitworth cannon was designed by Joseph Whitworth and manufactured in England. This gun was not used extensively during the war, but it was a step in the direction of what we consider modern artillery, in that it was loaded from the breech and had excellent accuracy over a great distance. This is what the open breech of the Whitworth looks like. The Whitworth was the artillery equivalent of a sharpshooting rifle because of its long-range capabilities, 2,800 yards at a 5-degree elevation compared to the Napoleon's 1,600-yard range. This degree of accuracy made it very effective in trying to take out enemy batteries and also for firing over bodies of water. It was not popular, though, as an anti-infantry weapon. The smoothbore cannon shot would ricochet off the ground and still do considerable damage to advancing infantry, whereas the bolt fired by the Whitworth would usually just bury itself in the ground. We haven't got time to go through all the weapons characteristics today, but you can see all the different ranges and so on here. Let's talk about the very first use of balloons in time of war. Professor Thaddeus Lowe is the Union aeronaut that gets credit for this. Lowe never completed his formal education. He is noted for building one of the largest balloons ever constructed to cross the Atlantic Ocean from 1859 to 1860. He held the flight endurance records for distance and altitude and invented the first altimeter used without a horizon. Lowe is known as the grandfather of the United States Air Force after being appointed to the position of Chief Aeronaut of the Union Army by President Abraham Lincoln in 1861. The top military brass, however, were not impressed with Mr. Lowe's balloons and wanted nothing to do with them. Lincoln finally demanded that General Scott see Professor Lowe and give him a chance to demonstrate his balloon. Serving under General George McClellan in this civilian post, Lowe constructed 5 balloons for a total of 7 to be used to spy on the Confederate Army. Although McClellan was a supporter of this new technology, Lowe had to continually convince traditionally minded military men of the benefits of aerial reconnaissance.
Major, this is Professor Thaddeus Lowe. He'll go up in his balloon to direct your artillery fire. I want those red guns silenced.
This civilian is going to direct my fire from that balloon, sir?
That's what I said, Major.
What will you do? Point?
No, Major. My balloon is equipped with telegraph key, air-to-ground telegraph cable. I send down the exact target locations. Thank you, General.
Do you know how to plot artillery targets?
Little guns. I hate guns. Professor Lowe will be flying with an expert observer.
Then all we need is an artilleryman crazy enough to go up in that fraction.
Precisely why I sent for you, Major.
Lowe was not only the first prisoner of the Civil War, but was considered the most shot at man as well due to his high profile while aloft. Civil War balloons provided aerial reconnaissance of the enemy. Lowe made hydrogen gas by combining iron and sulfuric acid. Soldiers will slowly let out the cables, allowing the balloon to rise. Communication while airborne was by balloon to ground telegraph cable. Balloons were often targeted by infantry and artillery, but through the entire war, not one of them was ever hit. This is the George Washington Parke Custis, the world's very first aircraft carrier. And George Washington Parke Custis was a coal barge, which was built in the mid-1850s. It was purchased by the Union Navy in August of 1861. It was fitted out with a gas-generating apparatus developed by Thaddeus Lowe and modified by Dahlgren at the Washington Navy Yard for her service as a balloon barrage. And this balloon will go down the James River and report on Confederate positions. So airborne from a boat, the first aircraft carrier. After George McClellan fell out of favor with Abraham Lincoln and he was replaced as commander of the Union Army, balloon use for aerial reconnaissance fell off. Let's talk now about the Anaconda Plan. Of course, one of the first things that Lincoln did was he enforced a blockade of southern ports. And of course, by putting it that way, he basically recognized the legitimacy of the Confederacy, because you never blockade your own ports, you close them. But at any rate, he now has to try to strangle the South from all the resources it needs to carry out the war. And that was no small task. With 3,500 miles of coastline, 10 major ports, and hundreds of bay and inlets, it was quite the job. We started out with maybe 36 ships that were in the blockade. And then, of course, we had the industrial might to make many, many more ships. The South, on the other hand, had very few ships to try to run that blockade. And so they had to also try to get rid of our ships that were enforcing the blockade. So with so few ships, they had to make the ships they had very strong. And so they turned to an ironclad. The Confederate answer to the Union blockade was the Virginia. The Virginia was constructed on the hull of the salvaged Union USS Merrimack. The Virginia steaming toward the blockading Union fleet. Of course, the Battle of Hampton Roads is where it makes its debut. I have clips that I would love to show you of this battle as recreated by a film called Ironclads, but we don't have the time today. Invite me back sometime when I've got 90 minutes for this presentation. The Merrimack set the Congress on fire. It also sunk the Cumberland using its ram. This is the interior shot of what the Virginia or Merrimack would have looked like. After sinking the Cumberland and the Congress, the Confederate Navy rules the seas for 1 day. And then the Union answer to the Virginia is the Monitor. John Erickson was the inventor of the Monitor. And no one had ever seen anything like it. People called it a hat on a box or a cheese box on a shingle. And the Monitor had 40 patented inventions on the ship, including, I believe, a flush toilet. Cutaway view of the Monitor's turret with her 2-inch Dahlgren guns, gigantic guns. The Merrimack or the Virginia had 24 guns on her, and of course the Merrimack only needed 2 because of its revolving turret. This is a picture of the turret and the deck, the cutaway view. There's 2 steam engines rotating that turret 360 degrees. The specifications of the Monitor you can see right there. The main thing is she had a draft of 10 feet 4 inches compared to a draft much deeper with the Virginia. In reality, the Monitor could fire safely only over 200 degrees of the 360 degree circle that she was designed for. And that was for safety reasons. The crew did not want to fire over the pilot house at the bow, nor the high pressure boilers at her stern. Top speed of the Monitor was 8 knots. Monitor's turret awning and smokestacks were always removed before battle. The inventor, John Erickson, was not an easy man to get along with, and he was angry at the U.S. Navy for not paying him after the Princeton tragedy. I want to show you this clip from Ironclads that shows Erickson explaining his and describing his invention, the Monitor, to the cabinet, Lincoln cabinet.
The beauty of my invention is that the turret turns to bring guns to bear on target. You don't have to turn the whole ship.
I see you've already named your ship, the Monitor.
It's perfect name, Mr. President. The Monitor restrains and corrects wrongdoers, your enemies.
Mr. Erickson, I assume there's more to your ship than the model shows.
The model only shows the ironclad portion above water, Mr. Secretary. If you had studied my drawings, you would know that below the waterline is a wooden hull housing 2 engines and quarters for the crew.
I'm concerned about the stability of this vessel, Mr. Erickson.
and I looked at all your figures.
To look is one thing. To know the mathematics required to understand is another.
Your personal remark, sir, does not answer my concern.
Because of the accident on board the Princeton, was a ship that he designed and a gun that he designed, which blew up and killed some Washington officials. They were hesitant to trust the man. The Monitor arrives in Hampton Roads at night and protects the Minnesota. And the Minnesota was grounded. It could not escape the Virginia. The Virginia had gone back to the Gosport Navy Yard the night before, was going to come out and finish her the next morning. And when she comes out, she sees the Monitor there to defend her. And of course, the first battle between ironclads was on March 9th, 1862. And the Virginia statistics, notice the draft of the vehicle was much deeper than the Monitor, and so it could not go in places that the Monitor was able to go. In fact, she even got stuck on a sandbar or shoal while she was fighting and couldn't get off for a while. Manning the Dahlgrens in the Monitor's cramped turret. The men inside that turret were extremely nervous until the first cannonball hit. They weren't sure that the iron plating was thick enough to stop the guns of the Virginia, but they did. One gun was fired at a time through portholes guarded by port stoppers weighing 1,200 pounds each. The noise in the turret was deafening. Those men came out with eardrums that were broken and bleeding. The Virginia's draft after loading 200 tons of ballast in her bottom was 22 feet compared to the Monitor's draft of less than 12 feet. The Battle of Hampton Roads, Virginia was hit 20 times by the Monitor's guns. Remember, that's only 2 guns. And the Monitor was hit 22 times by the Virginia's guns. After a 2-hour battle ends in a draw, the Virginia heads back to Gosport. And there's the Monitor's crew after the battle. Who won the Battle of Hampton Roads? Many people say it was a tie, but some say that the Monitor did its job by guarding the fleet in Hampton Roads, and the Virginia was not able to come out after that, and so they say that the Monitor won. At any rate, what happened to the ships afterwards? On May 11th, 1862, the Confederates blew up the Virginia to prevent Union capture. And on her way to join the blockading fleet off of Charleston, South Carolina, the Monitor encounters rough seas and a storm off Cape Hatteras. Most of the crew escaped with their lives, but the Monitor goes down on December 31st, 1862. They raised the Monitor's hull in August of 2002, and this is what it looked like inside with the Dahlgren guns still inside the turret. Another view inside the turret. The Monitor and Merrimack led the way for many other ironclads in all shapes and sizes, as you can see here. The story of the H.L. Hundley is almost pure tragedy. This is a submarine developed for the Confederate cause. James McClintock, Baxter Watson, and Horace Hundley built their first submarine in New Orleans. It was called the Pioneer. After Union forces took New Orleans, they deserted it in April of 1862. The inventors then moved to Mobile, Alabama. There they designed a second sub, the unsuccessful American Diver. The inventors kept on trying, with Horace Hundley providing the bulk of the financial support. For that reason, the third boat was named after him. The Hundley was sometimes referred to as the CSS Hundley, but she was privately built and never formally purchased by or commissioned into the Confederate Navy. The Hundley was just over 40 feet long, less than 4 feet wide, and 4 feet 3 inches from top to bottom. 8 or 9 men were cramped into that space, all but one sitting sideways on a bench. The Hundley was propelled by means of a gigantic crank that ran the length of the tiny vessel. The crank was attached to a propeller. The crew used their muscle power to move the craft along while the captain steered from the forward position. She was designed to attack by using a torpedo placed on the end of a 17-foot iron pole or spar with a barbed metal point fixed on the end. The Hundley would jam the spar and torpedo into a Union ship, leaving the torpedo stuck in the hull. Then back away to a safe distance to pull the line, which would detonate the torpedo. This is a cutaway view of the torpedo with the black powder and the detonator shown. The Hundley is transported by rail to Charleston, South Carolina, to attack the blockading Union fleet. 2 attempts to get close enough to Union ships resulted in the Hundley going down to the bottom each time. On the first attempt, 5 of 8 crew members drowned. On the second attempt, Hundley himself was in command and failed to close a flood valve. The sub sank, killing all 8 of the crew members aboard, including Hundley. The Hundley then did sink the Housatonic in Charleston Harbor on February 17, 1864. The Hunley, though, does not surface after the sinking of the Housatonic. And this is the interior of the raised Hunley. The Union Navy also came up with a submarine called the Alligator. It was not real successful, but as successful as the Hunley was, and it didn't amount to much. Railroads are going to win the Civil War, definitely. Technology before the war played a role in tying the parts of the country together economically, socially, and politically. In the 1830s, canals provided the means of transporting goods between the Northwest and the Northeast. After 1840, though, railroads began to be the most popular form of transportation. Western farmers shipped their products east on railroads. Manufacturers used the same rails to ship necessary goods west to farmers and farm communities. The rapid growth of railroads in America demonstrated how much this form of transportation was relied upon. In 1840, the country had a total of 2,818 miles of railroad track. By 1850, the United States had laid a total of 9,000 miles of track. By 1860, the country could claim 31,000 miles of track, 22,000 miles in the north, and 9,000 miles in the south. The Civil War was a railroad war. Although the South did not have as many miles of railroads or the capacity to extend its lines, the Confederacy also used the new technology during its struggle against the Union. Railroads allowed military commanders to move troops, equipment, and supplies over long distances more quickly than by marching, which was the traditional means of military transportation. Although marching remained the primary method of moving troops from one location to the next, the use of railroads allowed commanders to change the size of their armies overnight. This ability could change the outcome of a battle. An example of this was the arrival of Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston's troops from the Shenandoah Valley just in the nick of time to turn the tide of battle, leading to a victory for the South at the First Battle of Bull Run. The iron rails became logistics and communication lifelines. The Army's success depended on the men and material provided by their government and carried to them by train. Railroads served as the pipeline for food, blankets, arms, munitions, letters, and anything else a moving mass of tens of thousands of men might need or want. Supply depots allowed the Army to send supplies by rail to points near their troops before transporting the materials, the remaining distance overland by transportation by Army mules. Military commanders on both sides also used trains to transport wounded and sick soldiers away from the front to receive medical treatment. Military trains carried mobile artillery. This allowed commanders to reposition heavy guns for both defensive and offensive operations. As the war went on, the military began to keep some artillery permanently mounted on rail cars. This reduced the preparation time for combat. This also eliminated the continued reconstruction of a platform each time a military force moved a large artillery piece. Civilian leaders in the South understood the importance of the railroads to the war effort, and they gave President Jefferson Davis the power to organize them, but he never used this authority. Because of this, the inefficiencies of the Southern railroads helped to limit the success of the Southern cause. The Union took a different approach to railroad companies in the North. Although the federal government threatened to seize the railroads, it also offered incentives to rail companies to gain their cooperation. Because it needed efficient working rail companies to carry out the war, the federal government agreed to pay rates at levels that were profitable for the railroad companies. In the spring of 1862, a year after the start of the Civil War, the U.S. War Department organized a new bureau responsible for constructing and operating military railroads in the United States. On April 27, 1862, Herman Haupt was appointed chief of the Bureau by Secretary of War Edmund Stanton as a colonel and an aide-de-camp to Major General Irvin McDowell, then in the command of the defenses of Washington, D.C. Haupt repaired and fortified war-damaged railroad lines in the vicinity of Washington. He armed and trained railroad staff and improved telegraph communications along the railroad lines. Among his most challenging assignments was the restoring of the strategic Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad line, including the Potomac Creek Bridge after its partial destruction by Confederate forces. That man Haupt, this is a quote from Abraham Lincoln. He said, "That man Haupt has built the bridge across the Potomac Creek, about 400 feet long and nearly 100 feet high, over which loaded trains are running every hour. And upon my word, gentlemen, there is nothing in it but bean poles and corn stalks. During the Gettysburg campaign in the summer of 1863, Haupt's hastily organized trains kept the Union Army well supplied, and he organized the returning trains to carry thousands of Union wounded to hospitals. Haupt left the service in September of 63, but during his service, he developed and implemented general principles of railroad supply operation and also detailed methods of construction and destruction of railroad equipment that would be implemented until the end of the war. His two main principles were that the military should never interfere with the efficient running of the railroad, and that rolling stock should be emptied and returned promptly to enable their reuse as transport. This is the typical American type 440 engine, the workhorse of the military railroad. Of course, railroads were so important to both sides that it was a common practice to try and tear up those rails of the enemy to inhibit their reinforcement and resupply. So they couldn't reuse the rails. Sherman's men started heating up the rails on bonfires and then twisting them around poles or trees, and they started calling them Sherman's bow ties. The idea for a signal service came from an Army doctor serving in Texas before the war. His name was Albert James Meyer. The idea, introduced in 1856, was that a specially trained signal service could benefit the US military by using a system of aerial telegraphy in which Corps members communicated with one another using flags during the day and then torches at night. The Army put Meyer's system into operation on June 21st, 1860. Less than a year before the outbreak of the Civil War. To start with, Meyer was the only signal officer in the US Army Signal Corps. The Army first put Meyer and his system to use out west during the Navajo expedition of 1860 to 61. Meyer also signaled during the June 1861 military engagement at Fort Monroe in Virginia. Meyer's system worked well and helped the Union commanders to remain in communication with their officers. Despite these successes, Meyer had problems keeping trained signalers who were called wigwaggers. The Army periodically ordered officers and enlisted men to assist Meyer, but they would not be placed under his command. March, the Army but
Arn, that really was not the hook that I reached out and grabbed you with, but for some reason, streaming has stopped from your presentation. I don't know if others were still getting Arn's voice or not, but it totally, I'm seeing head shaking. So for whatever reason, at 3:42, and through no cause of my own, the hook has been applied. And we will have to pick up the rest of the presentation at some time when streaming is working a little bit better. At this point, I'm just going to make a final remark that, again, thank you for joining us for the symposium this year. Next year, we hope to go to a full day, probably most likely in Litchfield with a bus tour following, and probably with a shuttle bus from the western part of the Twin Cities. We will be forming a committee a little later on this year to try to set up the programs for next year, since we've used 3 of the programs from last year today. We'll need obviously some new programs. So if you would like to participate, please get in touch with me through the Twin Cities Civil War Roundtable. And I thank you very much for signing on and participating this year. And we hope to see you a year from now out in Litchfield.